Well, happy Holy Week, everyone. Today is Monday, and we are looking at what happened on this day in history. Now, I want you to remember that yesterday, Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey. He was proclaiming himself to be both their king, the king of Israel, and the long hoped for and the long anticipated Messiah. As the crowds lined the street on both sides, they threw down palm branches and their cloaks so that Jesus would be able to walk over them and ride his donkey over them. They were acknowledging that he was the Messiah, that he was the king. They praised him, and Jesus received their worship. And that is key. Jesus was actually receiving their worship. But when he came closer to Jerusalem and got a fresh view of the city in front of him, he actually began to weep because though everything looked good on the outside, as if they were fully accepting him and embracing him, he knew that their praise would not last the rest of the week. And because of their later rejection, that they would eventually suffer judgment. And so this is how we ended yesterday. It says in Mark 11:11, "And Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. And I told you that that was key, that there was something in there that we were going to hone in on today. And it's the fact that Jesus went into Jerusalem, into the temple, and he looked around. He looked this way and he looked that way. And he saw everything that was going on. He saw all of the businessmen who had basically set up shop on the temple grounds. And now, it wasn't a sin to sell animals for sacrifice. We actually see this in the law of Moses. In Leviticus, there's a prescription for this. Not everyone grew all of the different types of grain or raised all the different types of animals that you would need for offerings and sacrifices. And so there would be people in Jerusalem who would be selling these things, that they would be perfect, ideal sacrifices or offerings that the people would be able to use for the temple, for what they were coming for. However, what we see in this passage is that they were misusing the temple because they were doing it inside the temple, and they were taking advantage of the people through their greed. This is why Jesus will say that they've turned his house of prayer into a den of robbers. They were robbing the people. But when Jesus saw this on Palm Sunday, late at night, he saw this. His response was not to get angry, not to be overcome within him and flip tables then. His response was to leave. He went back to Bethany with his disciples. He did not allow his anger to get the best of him in that moment. And what I want to point out right here is Jesus modeled prayer in his life throughout all the gospel accounts. Jesus modeled for us what it looked like to entrust himself, his whole life, his thoughts, his attitudes, the things he said, the things he did. He entrusted his entire life to the Father. He wanted to know the Father's will. And so in Luke chapter 6, verses 12 through 16, there's an example early on in Jesus' ministry when he had a big decision. And this was his response. It was the choosing of the 12 apostles. Jesus, it says this, "In these days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles." You see, Jesus didn't even choose his apostles without first praying to God. After Jesus fed the 5,000 in Mark chapter 6, it says that he put the disciples in a boat, sent them off. He dismissed the crowd, get away, and then he went up onto a mountain and prayed. He spent time in prayer to God. I believe this is something that Jesus did right here after this night, Palm Sunday, that night, he went back home to think, to pray, to reflect. And then early the next morning, after finding out the will of God, he went into the city of Jerusalem. And so Jesus left and he went to Bethany, which was just 2 miles outside the city. So they can see the city. They're right there. But I want you to think also about parenting. This is something that we learn in parenting classes. If you are angry, you do not immediately make decisions. You need to go away, pray, reflect, think about the situation, think about the consequences so that you can make a rational decision. And Mark gives us a clear and concise chronology of events. So if you're looking for a chronological day-by-day basis of what's going on, the book of Mark is your go-to. Mark 11:12 through 14, this is what happened on Monday. On the following day, When they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree and leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Now, this may sound strange and even a bit rash. You may be thinking, I know it's Monday. Mondays are usually a bad day. But did you really need to curse it, Jesus? What we have to remember is that Jesus, like I just said, Jesus never just does anything flippantly. And he, as we will see, as we've already seen, Jesus never allows his anger to get the best of him. So what was going on here? Well, to be clear, this was not fig season. Mark even made a note of that. This is not the season for figs. Fig season, when the figs were fully ripe, was about May or June. That being said, many fig trees by late March, early April, about this time, would actually begin bearing small green figs that peasants and travelers and people would actually still eat during this time. And so from a distance, this tree looked very great. It looked promising. It looked like, it was full of leaves and it looked like there would be fruit on this tree. If you would have walked by at this time and knew what kind of tree this was, then you too would think there must be fruit. At least a few figs that I can find to quench my hunger. But upon closer examination, there wasn't any fruit, not a single fig. And Jesus judged the tree because of this. And he used this as a teaching moment for his disciples. He then led his disciples into the temple. And this is what Mark 11:15-19 says. And they came to Jerusalem, and he entered the temple, began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations'? But you have made it a den of robbers." And the chief priests and the scribes heard it and were seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. And when evening came, they went out of the city. Jesus, what we have to remember is Jesus did not come into Jerusalem that day to overturn the rule of Rome. He came into Jerusalem that day, into the temple that day, to overturn the tables of Israel. Remember the crowds that yesterday had lined the streets. They laid down palm branches, they ripped off their cloaks and laid them down for him to walk across, acknowledging that he was the Messiah. Remember those same crowds that praised him yesterday and called upon him for salvation? Well, like the tree, from a distance, everything looked great. Israel looked great, like they were bearing fruit. But upon closer examination, there was no fruit. Thus, there was no blessing. There was no blessing given to the tree, and there was no blessing that Jesus could give to Israel. Ephesians 4:26 says, "Be angry and do not sin." But how is that even possible? How do we do that? What does that even look like? Well, it looks like Jesus. Take a look at Mark 11, verse 15, the very end of that verse. It says that Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. You see, even in Jesus' anger, when he was expressing righteous anger, he did not allow his anger to control him. He went up to the tables that were receiving the money, the taxes and the offerings and charging for all the sacrifices. And he overthrew those tables and drove the people out. But then he went to the seats of those who sold the pigeons. There were tables that had pigeons and birds in cages, and he did not flip the tables. And that's something that we have to take note of. Jesus maintained full composure, full control over himself. He did not hurt the birds. He just overturned their seats and drove the people out. In Matthew chapter 21, verses 14-17, this is what happened next. It says this, "And the blind and the lame came to him in the temple, and he healed them. But when the chief priests and the scribes saw the wonderful things that he did, and the children crying out in the temple, 'Hosanna to the Son of David,' they were indignant. And they said to him, 'Do you hear what these are saying?' And Jesus said to them, 'Yes. Have you never read? Out of the mouth of infants and nursing babies, you have prepared praise.' And leaving them, he went out of the city to Bethany and lodged there." You see, Jesus stayed in the temple for a while, and the blind and the lame were being led to Jesus, and he was healing them. He was performing miracles. So the chief priests, the religious leaders, they couldn't actually touch Jesus at this moment, even though they were indignant, because even the children now were coming and saying, "Hosanna to the Son of David." They were repeating, the children here were repeating the words of their parents the day before. And this made the religious leaders absolutely indignant, absolutely mad at him. And then Jesus left them. He left the temple, he left Jerusalem, and he went to Bethany, less than 2 miles away, and lodged there. Remember, he's staying with Lazarus during this time. And this is what happened on Monday, on this day in history. Happy Holy Week, everyone. Bye.